the slide. I just want to acknowledge, is it a down arrow or the forward arrow? Down arrow. Okay, before I get to that, before I get to the racing slide, and I'm not going to, I thought there was some, well, it's not here, and so this might be the awkward part. And I understand, I got the conceptual stuff down, whether I have Molly's timing and her animation down, so if it looks a little strange, you'll have to forgive me. But what I do want to acknowledge before I get started, and I can't remember if this shows up, is that the thinking that we've put into this is in large part, we'd like to acknowledge this climate smart working group that we've been involved with, kind of a national level group, looking at how to integrate climate change considerations into conservation and natural resource planning. So this isn't all just our thinking. It's a whole host of people that are part of this larger national scale project. Oh, there they are. There's some of them. Somebody said Deb Flaxman, for those of you guys in the LTC community, you might recognize her. She's in California. So this is Molly's racing slide, which I want to take credit for. If you prefer, you can overlay Paris projections of change if you just want to look at the slide and not shifting undergarment size. But the point being here is it's not about whether climate is changing, but really what we need to do about it, because obviously from this graphic, we know climate is changing. So what I'm going to talk about today are two things, and hopefully the transition won't be too awkward, and that is thinking about our conservation goals. The topic has come up a couple of times already today. So we'll talk about some of the consequences or challenges that climate change brings to thinking about our conservation goals and thinking about whether we should be changing them. And then also this question of taking this large landscape scale perspective, it came up very much in this more recent conversation that we just had following Annette's talk. But why this is good and how it can be balanced with that more local perspective as well. So I'm going to start here with conservation goals. So the challenge that climate change brings to conservation goals is it upends a lot of our traditional assumptions. First of all, a lot of our protected areas, especially, were put in place because they're protecting this thing in this place. Wildlife refuge, there are a lot of examples of that from the National Park Service land, and in this working group that we've been involved with, we do have some National Park Service participants, and this question of, we have these mandates or we have these goals, and climate change is really putting a kibosh on them. How do we start thinking about that now? There's just also this question about, we often refer to what's native, what's natural. Molly has a few examples here about maintaining, thinking about people's goals, maintaining natural abundance, diversity and genetic and ecological integrity of native plant and animal species. Kind of the question of what that all means in a time of rapidly changing climate. Oftentimes, because of our perspective, we look at the historic conditions. This has been, my background's in forest disturbance ecology, and we look a lot to the pre-settlement era to think about, what's the composition, what's the structure supposed to be like for these places that we're interested in. What do we want to restore to? Looking back at the historic conditions. And then, broadening the sense, managing for this historic range of variability. There's always variability. It's not a fixed condition. The challenge, and this has been brought up before, that climate change brings onto this is that we're dealing with fractional change. So we're moving outside of what is or what has been the historic range of variability, at least in the human conscious perspective. And then a sense of in perpetuity. I had a little bit of a career with a land trust doing stewardship on land, and a lot of the conservation easements that are put in place are in perpetuity. Think about how that'll play out in a changing climate, especially since we're very keen in the land trust perspective, establishing baselines and not having that change and measuring everything against that. So I'm going to pause here to be interactive for you all. So I'm going to talk about, because Molly and I are coming off a bit of travel not too long before we were coming here, and that is we were piloting some of these concepts that have developed through this national working group around bringing climate change into natural resource management, and we had folks bring their goals. There were a lot of agencies, actually a fair amount of state agencies at this pilot training, and I was not going to mention which state this was, but I see it's already here. We had some goals from the state of Idaho, their fisheries management folks. And I just want you to take a few minutes and have a look at this set of goals. Because what I'm going to ask you to do is, as you read through these, are these red flags that jump out at you about, what might not be realistic in a longer term perspective. So give me a couple minutes and we can have a discussion about this. So is there anything that jumps out at anybody that they want to volunteer as a thought on, what you might flag if you were thinking about reevaluating these goals in the context of time change?
Historical range. Before it jumps out at me.
Yeah. Historical range. Anybody else? Current range. Anything? Anybody else? So when we're looking at this, these are some of the things that we, as a group, as a larger group, this training, we're looking at, this long-term persistence, this idea of imperpetuity. Things aren't going to change. We're going to be able to carry this on for the next 300 years. And the current range in Idaho is thousands out. Levels capable of providing angling opportunities. This is another one that's a little bit more subtle, but in our region of the world, I'm from Bozeman, Montana. And I can't remember last summer or the summer before, there were actually fishing closures in some of the streams in our region because the temperatures were too hot. So it may not be possible to maintain population levels where they're capable of always providing angling opportunities. And then this idea of the historical range in Idaho, restoring things to where they are. There's been some studies in that region that have looked at the vulnerability of different streams. Our issues there, for those of you who aren't fisheries managers, and I'm not a fisheries manager either, but I am very aware of what's going on in the region in which we work, and that is low flow water temperatures, making previous habitat sites no longer suitable for some of these species. So, one of the things that we called out when we're talking about bringing climate change into planning is not only thinking about what actions you might do differently or what strategies you might take that are different, but also taking a good long look at what goals and how they hold up in the long run. So Molly has this example from, she sits on the steering committee of the Great Northern LCC. And so she was going to bring up this example to pick on the vision statement of the Great Northern, but I'm going to go right over that because I don't sit on the steering committee and I don't necessarily want to sit involved. But just based on that quick example we gave about goals, so what are the themes? Can anybody come up with any ideas of what we might need to consider? This theme has come up several times, or a couple of these themes have come up several times in the course of the earlier parts of today, but what do you think we do need to consider? Anybody? So obviously different spatial scales, maybe not the entire current range or the historical range. Thinking about your goals and fiddling with the spatial scales at which you think about things, want to plan around things. But also this idea of temporal scales. Maybe our goals are going to be time bound. Maybe this is our goal for now. We've been involved in several kind of planning exercises around climate change, and there have been a couple where the end result of looking at impacts and vulnerabilities is that these goals might be good for the next 10 years, but we need to revisit these because we think that we're not going to be able to achieve these over the long term. So just some things, other things that we might need to consider. Being more accepting of change. Molly's actually in the process. She's been called upon to give are people familiar with TED Talks? Yeah. So Molly's been called to give a local TED Talk or a local TEDx thing. And part of it is around, when a lot of folks think about climate change, they get a little depressed because of the idea of changing systems and changing. And one of the things that we've been thinking about is why are folks so accepting of technological change and not of landscape change? So it's just kind of a theme that's come up in the context of developing this TED Talk. And I don't know, Val, if this is the example that you were calling upon, but the Wildlife Conservation Society, we run a REGRANT program that is explicitly about funding climate change adaptation projects that are going to be implemented on the ground. And this is one of the ones that we funded in a recent round. And in this case, they are being more accepting of change. You know, they're in areas that have been harvested. They're sometimes maybe bringing species up from the south, but also kind of rearranging, planting species from the region that are more tolerant of warming and drying conditions, and maybe broadening the seed sources from which those maybe some more southern ecotypes, more southern ecotypes, to plant in these sites. So I think, people have touched upon this today too a lot. Being more focused on the processes rather than patterns. I think Fiona brought up hydrological processes. That's one example. Just building your goals around that rather than this idea of we have to have these species in this place in this structural way. So the ecological processes. There's also this idea of thinking about ecosystem services maybe in a different way. Carrie earlier today was alluding to maybe a shift in the Boreal from black spruce-dominated or spruce-dominated sites to aspen. We can be a little bit proactive in thinking about that and think about, how would we, it's still fiber, it's just a different kind of fiber, and how might we utilize that in a different way. So it's just the thinking that it's important that we have these services, maybe not from what they come specifically. And then there's this concept, and I don't know how many of you are familiar with this, protecting the geophysical stage, or conserving, maybe focusing goals on conserving evolutionary opportunities, kind of like the coarse filter versus fine filter approach, capturing the diversity, in this case, of the geological or geophysical setting, so that species have opportunities to adapt in different ways or respond in different ways to climate as we move forward. So kind of forming your goals or evaluating your goals, thinking in a slightly different way with climate change. So there are obviously challenges to revisiting goals. We're all, particularly in agencies, probably particularly aware of these. There's the idea of authority and vehicle constraints. I think you mentioned this earlier, Eric, how difficult it is to be nimble when a lot of our goals are outdated. There are psychological barriers. I mean, some folks have built their careers, and maybe this goes back to the next generation is really where these changes are going to be manifest. But some folks have built their careers from protecting specific species, and it's a little bit depressing, and you have to say, oh, I have to let that one go here. The limits of our knowledge, acknowledging the breadth of uncertainty, the different sources from which it comes, and trying to tease that apart, and realizing that that's a challenge to reevaluating your goals and actually settling on something new. And this comes back to the LCC and thinking about across scales and coordinating across jurisdictions at a large landscape scale. And this is supposed to be our smooth transition into the second part of our talk, because we're going to shift from talking specifically about goals, but talking about why, and why think at a landscape scale. And we all, we've acknowledged this again today about different agencies, public, private lands. It's hard to coordinate at the landscape scale because of a lot of the history and the context in which we work. So, moving on to taking the large landscape scale perspective, but maybe I'll just stop for a minute because relay and filling in for mine, I do have a tendency to talk quickly, although I know you are hoping that I'll but I will pause to say, does anybody have any questions about the first part?
Another challenge, how about that a lot of local species are food
for humans, yeah.
I may bang on what I want about essential ecosystem characteristics of person, but people are always more concerned about using the regular salad.
But I think I don't know the trade reference to wood buffalo. And I know some of those systems are already shifting, right?
There's opportunities.
Yeah, and so acknowledging those as opportunities. But I've also heard of instances where there's almost like a taste, almost connected, things don't taste right if you're switching resources. So, I mean, it comes back to the things in a particular place, but acknowledging that, yeah, there are these challenges. Just for instance. Do you guys have any questions or comments on that first step?
I'm going to point out that the Fish and Wildlife Service, I don't know if the trout example, before if they are actually a listed species or not, but if they are listed, those would be actually very similar goals to the protection and recovery of the species that is actually required under the law. And so, our agency goes with that. Such a large proportion of our budget is now driven by requirements, challenged by lawsuits and whatnot. And you have a smaller and smaller amount of discretionary funds to use in what is some more innovative ways of protecting the species.
Right. That's so much mandate.
Yeah.
Yeah, definitely.
It's a psychological barrier. I think when I did the psychological and institutional, it's our inability to say that's what we will run.
Yeah, because it's disincentivized, right? In many situations.
You don't get any grants for a long time.
Yeah. So it's I think somebody made a comment about resetting expectations of the public, both of our agencies, our funders. Yeah, that's a very good point. And that is such a fine line. So the idea that we're not using climate change as an excuse to, we want to rephrase that to justify in the past, yeah. And so I think that's giving us some right. Very and attribution is difficult in a lot of cases, for sure. But it is kind of that reevaluation process to look back. And I think that's kind of the point. Not that we necessarily have to change them, but that we go through some kind of reevaluation process on it. So taking a large landscape perspective, the value of thinking big about things, and we also heard about the value of thinking small about things. So I don't want to contrast these in any negative way. These are actually parts of a whole, and it's something that, if Molly is here to talk about the ACT framework tomorrow, that you'll get a little bit better sense about how we kind of view this. But it's the value of thinking big, both about thinking about the impacts and vulnerabilities, but also about the options that are available in any one place on the landscape versus looking at it from a larger perspective. And this is the idea that it's really useful to know, even if you are focused on that the problem finding at that smaller scale, it's really useful to know where these smaller pieces of landscape fit into a bigger place, and the bigger picture. And here I have this is Idaho, Montana, Wyoming, Yellowstone National Park, surrounded by national forest land. You might have this landscape that, whatever it is, the landscape of the community pest, the species is less vulnerable across the landscape. But it's highly vulnerable in this one management unit within the landscape. And so the question is at the management unit scale, are you going to take drastic measures? If you've got your blinders on and you're only thinking about your management unit and this species or community type or whatever process is very important to you, and you're going to do whatever you can to deal with this highly vulnerable entity. But yet, if you kind of step back a little bit, you'd be like, the landscape scale, this broader perspective, it's not so vulnerable. So if we don't want to commit our resources here, this thing will still be present on the broader landscape. And then there's kind of the reverse situation where whatever this thing is vulnerable across the entire landscape. But in your little spot, your little neck of the woods, it's less vulnerable. And if you don't pay attention to that, kind of looking at it in this broader context, you might miss an opportunity, as Annette was talking about this morning, to protect our behavior that could have been critical in the longer term. it's not about whether one scale and the other is more appropriate. It's about thinking about both at the same time. So then we've been involved in a few vulnerability assessments, and what we find is that if you're focused on a smaller scale, people are really interested or really just like can't get their heads around or can't get beyond like what's going to be lost. And this and not thinking about so much I know there's animation here. What's moving into the system behind it? And what we might be doing proactively to manage that, and maybe missing some opportunities. There again, that idea of looking at this broader context. And then there's just some sense that not just adaptation actions, but management and natural resource actions require this cross-jurisdictional coordination. Some of my colleagues at WCS work on seasonal pronghorn migration, and that's not across a vast landscape, but a significant enough landscape where you're going across multiple jurisdictions. So just for an example, say you are a manager of Yellowstone National Park, and right now it's a probably lodgepole dominated system into the ponderosa pine, and it's moving into the park, and that's wait for it. That's what you want to do. You've decided that we're just going to accept change. We're going to let transition to ponderosa pine. But all the Forest Service lands around you, I think training really say that we are all about resisting change. So maybe they want to keep managing lodgepole pines and forests all around you. And so there's a question of how effective your actions are going to be to allow transition if the surrounding landscape is practicing more resistance strategy, and this is particularly true in the case of invasive species kind of management questions. And so call questions to whether those actions are sustainable over the long term. And then also from this landscape scale, we all recognize, acknowledge that there's an economy of scale questions, but sometimes it's just more efficient as well to pool resources and think about prioritizing across the landscape for sharing information. So, I told you I could take time. How are you on my take-home messages? So obviously climate change causes challenges. The traditional assumptions underlying the goals that all of us have in our agencies and organizations. This idea that climate-informed goals, one of the key things is thinking about different spatial scales and also different temporal scales. And acknowledging that there may be some roles. The whole setup that Terry gave this morning about the ability to shape change, to what level we can shape change, and kind of embracing the idea that we might do that. And then just the importance, the value of considering climate change at the local scale in the context of writing.